Reminder that the quiz, the first quiz is due on Sunday. It will be available tomorrow morning. It's not available today yet, but it will be available tomorrow morning. So you have Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to do it. It won't take you 3 days. It will only take you about 30 minutes. So you can use the key concepts list that I provided up to the point of today's class. So obviously the physiology will not cover anything that we haven't covered in class. And the anatomy, for preparing the anatomy part, use the coloring book as your guide to what could be on the quiz. The coloring book assignments are in the schedule for the course. So that's the way to think about preparing for the course. Use the concepts list and the coloring book. Like I said, you'll pick up the quiz at the CST desk, you'll take it in CST, and you'll turn it in right then and there. Don't take it home, just take it in the CST. Put your books and notes and electronics away to minimize the temptation to look something up. Nobody wants to cheat, but it's tempting. So minimize the temptation. And if you see someone with a phone out or a book out, and they're in this class and this looks bad, you know what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to approach that person and say, hey, that looks bad. Or you can tell me. Go.
For the anatomy part, is it just going to be kind of like fill in the blanks of like spots, that kind of thing?
Mostly it will be filling in names of structures from a picture that you may or may not have seen in the coloring book. I mean, so it might include a picture from the coloring book, in which case you've already seen it, or it might include a different picture that you haven't seen. But it could be labeling, similar to what you're supposed to do in the coloring book. Well, you don't label in the coloring book, you color the names.
Right.
But yeah, so labeling is something that happens in that. Yeah. Okay, so today we're going to finish up our talk about action potentials and electricity, electrical activity in the heart. So we're going to start where we finished, but we'll review some of that a little bit. Then we're going to talk about how the heart rate is modulated or regulated by the nervous systems, by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. I'm not going to get into the neuroscience of this too much because that's the other course, but I need to get into the receptors and signal transduction mechanisms in the heart that allow these nervous systems to regulate the heart beat in particular. And then we'll talk about how we measure heart activity in the electrocardiogram, which you're going to be doing in lab this afternoon. So this class and the lab are pretty well synced. Okay, so as a reminder, the heartbeat starts in the SA node. Before the heartbeat, when the heart is at rest or in a period of diastole. Diastole is the resting condition. And now we're starting systole. And systole starts with depolarization and action potentials in the SA node. So here's a slightly modified slide from the one that we were talking about on Tuesday. Let's just go through this, reasonably fast. So let's start with the end of the previous heartbeat. So here's the previous heartbeat. What brought the membrane potential down were voltage-gated potassium channels that are opened by depolarization and closed by not depolarization. So when we have not depolarization, those channels close. So voltage-gated potassium channels that were open for the previous repolarization close. So the thing that is bringing the membrane potential down, which is potassium efflux, is going away. This polarization or hyperpolarization opens the IH channels. Sodium goes in, and sodium influx causes some slow depolarization. So IH closing of potassium channels and opening of IH channels is responsible for this transition from repolarization to slow depolarization. This slow depolarization opens a few voltage-gated calcium channels. So that helps maintain the depolarization because calcium flows in. Calcium's a cation, flows in, depolarization. At a certain point, we get more and more calcium channels open, and now we get a lot of calcium channels open. Remember, voltage-gated calcium channels are opened by depolarization, and they cause depolarization, so they have that same positive feedback loop that voltage-gated sodium channels have, but they're slower. They're slow. So we get a action potential, but it's slower than the ones in nerve, and it's slower than the ones in other parts of the heart that we're going to get to in a second. Okay, so let's just start the heartbeat, but I've already indicated how we would finish it, right? So let's just go to the start of the heartbeat. So this action potential in a cluster of cells in the SA node now spread. So now that action potential in the SA node spreads throughout the atrium because of gap junctions. Now we're here. We're talking about atrial systole. The cells in the atria are muscle cells. I mean, they're specialized for contraction. They're muscle cells. They do the job of pumping blood from the atria to the ventricles. So they are different from pacemaker cells. They have many resting K channels. When depolarized by their neighbor, they have many voltage-gated sodium channels, and which are fast relative to calcium channels. And so we get a lot of sodium influx. And that's a fast, large depolarization. That fast, large depolarization opens the slower calcium channels. So calcium channels don't play a role in the upstroke, but they do play a role in the plateau. And they also trigger contraction. Calcium influx, calcium release, calcium binds to troponin, contraction. So this calcium entering is the trigger for contraction. Okay, so let's stop there. We've now spread action potentials throughout the atria. Those atrial muscle cells are contractile. They have depolarized. They have allowed calcium to flow in. That calcium has triggered calcium release. That calcium has triggered contraction. We have atrial systole. Okay, now let's move on to a slightly new material. Now the contraction spreads from atria to ventricles. But it doesn't just spread like that. It spreads through the AV node. The AV node is the gateway for electrical activity to spread from the atria to the ventricles. Normally. There are abnormalities that have abnormal gateways that give rise to abnormal heartbeats, and those are called arrhythmias or dysrhythmias. But normally, the AV node is the gateway for electrical activity to spread from the atria to the ventricles. So we're now we want to talk about how do AV node cells work? And how do they enforce a delay? How do AV node cells enforce a delay between atrial systole and ventricular systole? The mechanism is simple. The idea is that AV nodal cells are almost exactly equal to SA nodal cells. They don't have open sodium channels. They have slow depolarizations, but most importantly, they have slow upstroke. This is the most important thing for the AV node. Slow depolarization. Slow kinetics of voltage-gated calcium channels cause a slow depolarization, which causes slow cell-to-cell spread of depolarization in the AV node. And that slowness of moving action potentials through the AV node the slowness of moving action potentials through the AV node causes the delay. Now you could say, well, wait a second, Bob. You said if an AV nodal cell looks just like an SA nodal cell, why isn't the AV node a pacemaker? And the answer is it can be a pacemaker, but it's a backup pacemaker. If the AV node spontaneously reached its own threshold, it would fire an action potential and become a backup pacemaker. But usually, the spread of depolarization reaches the AV node and causes the depolarization of AV node by its neighbor, by the neighbor, cell-to-cell-to-cell contact before, let me start that again, the spread of electrical activity through the atria. And so the reaching of the AV node, the reaching of the AV node firing its action potential is usually triggered by its neighbors and not usually triggered by itself. But eventually, the AV node would reach its own threshold and fire an action potential and become a backup pacemaker. If the SA node fails, the AV node is your first line of defense against a no heartbeat. Are those concepts clear? Why normally the AV node enforces a delay, and why abnormally the AV node can be your best backup pacemaker.
I'm confused on how it causes the delay if the slow depolarization is just as slow as the SA node cells.
So the SA node is slow, but it doesn't matter because the SA node is not enforcing a delay between anything and anything else. So it's true that conduction in the SA node is slow. But eventually the conduction gets out of the SA node, and now we spread fast through the atria because the atria have a fast action potential. Now we get to the AV node, and we spread slow. We spread slow because we have a slow action potential. And the difference between a fast action potential and a slow action potential is the presence or not of the voltage-gated sodium channels.
Question.
Yeah.
So before you say that the SA node, when a lot of outside cancers, they people have fast action potential.
No. When the SA node always fires a slow action potential. So it's slow and fast. So, okay, I see. Very slow, slow, fast.
No, before that. The SA.
This is the SA, well, okay, let's go to the SA node. It's the same figure.
The same thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very slow, slow, but faster than this. It's an action potential, but this is slow. This is fast relative to this, but this is slow relative to this. Okay, so maybe the simplest way to think about this is to go ultra slow, slow, fast.
Okay, I still don't understand like the delay.
Okay?
Like I guess not only like how it happens, but what's the purpose of the delay?
The purpose of the delay is to allow the atria to contract and pump blood from atria. Remember, the atria are receiving the blood, and atria will contract a fraction of a second, squeezing that received blood from atria to the ventricles before the ventricles contract to do the major job of squeezing the blood either to the lungs, in the case of the right ventricle, or to the body, in the case of the left ventricle. So atrial systole precedes ventricular systole in order to give, it's sort of like a ventricular helper. Pumping blood from the atria to the ventricles before the ventricles pump the blood from the ventricles to either the lungs or the body. That's normal. Now there are some people who don't have an atrial systole at all. My mother has atrial fibrillation. Her atria are not beating. Her heart's beating. Her ventricles are pumping blood, but her atria are not beating. And so you might say, well, wait a second. If the atria don't beat, how is the blood getting to the ventricles? Well, remember, during diastole, the blood is flowing passively from atria to the ventricles. So my mother's cardiac output is decreased by about 20% relative to our cardiac output, but she's also in her 80s, so her cardiac output is already decreased. Is that clear? So you don't have to have an atrial system, but we do. I'm sure all of us do, because it gives us about a 20% boost in our cardiac output. Chris?
Was she born with that condition?
No, she developed it with age. It's a real common thing that happens with age, with people during aging. We'll see if any of you have atrial fibrillation when we do electrocardiograms downstairs, but I'll be shocked if I see any atrial fibrillation. Questions?
So is the logic is that first there will be more initiations at the acting node, and
Yeah.
then it will trigger the contractile cells of the atria to pump, and then there will be execution potential, which is like the delay between the atrial and ventricle systole.
Right there in the AV node.
And then
we
the
haven't gotten the story.
ventricle-
Okay, and then the ventricles contract.
And the ventricle contract. When the ventricle contract, the contractile cell go through its same.
The same as the atria. The same as the. This is the same. This is the atria and the ventricles look almost exactly the same. And so now action potentials spread fast through the ventricles, aided by the bundle of His, the bundle branches, the Purkinje fibers, and just fast action potentials in the ventricle. Action potentials in the ventricle. Oh, sorry. Action potentials in the ventricle. Calcium influx, contraction, generation, pumping, action. We'll talk more about pumping next week. Yeah.
Also by contractile cell, you are excluding the tricuspid and also the bicuspid valve.
Tricuspid and bicuspid valves aren't really cells. It's just connective tissue. They're not contracting. The valves don't contract. The valves respond to contraction, but they're not doing any work of themselves. They're just flaps that are opening and closing in response to pressure and in response to tension on those chordae tendinii. The valves they're just flaps. They're not cells. So they're not contractile.
So I'm still confused between like the slow, fast action tensions that you're talking about and the delay.
Right.
So is the delay just the fact that the SA node, the action potentials are spreading and it takes a short time to get to the AV node?
No.
Or it has
It takes
to
a long time to get through the AV node.
And that's the delay?
Mm-hmm.
So going through all of the bundles and Purkinje fibers, or the actual?
Getting through that tiny little gateway takes time because the action potentials are slow there. So this is slow, but it doesn't matter. These are all fast, and it does matter. And they're also contractile. This is slow, so it delays. Getting through that little thing gives you and we're not talking about a 5-second delay. We're talking about a 100 millisecond delay. A short delay, but it's slow. It's small, it's slow, and then going, throughout the ventricles is fast. Good question. I mean, these are good. I want to make sure this communicates. Any other questions? So now we have ventricular systole, which is the most important pumping action, pumping from the right side of the heart, the right ventricles to the pulmonary lung circulation, and pumping from the left side of the heart, the left ventricle, to the systemic circulation. And we'll talk about repolarization in a minute when we get to the electrocardiogram. Any other questions?
So like previously in the last lesson, you talked about the fact that the core integrity and the fact that the muscles have increasing pressure and I wonder does that have any other functions?
Let's talk about that on Tuesday when we get to cardiac output. So the chordae tendinii, the papillary muscle, the valves obviously are important. But right now we're focusing on the spread of electrical activity, which doesn't involve the valves. So I know I talked about valves and flow on Tuesday. Now I'm focusing on electricity, and then on next Tuesday I will put this all together. I'd rather not jump to that. So I'm just going back too far. So now I want to transition to how the heart rate is modulated or regulated by the nervous system. You know the mechanisms. You know the mechanisms of the control of the heart rate. Now I want to show you how that control is modulated. Remember, the SA node controls the heart rate, but it is modulated by the nervous system. It's modulated by, so the sympathetic nervous system increases the heart rate, and the parasympathetic nervous system decreases the heart rate. So the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight response. This is the nervous system that gets you activated in the case of stress. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and relax nervous system, and it helps you rest and relax. It gets your heartbeat back to normal, or that even below normal when you're rested and relaxed. So let's talk about 3 general mechanisms for how you could control the heart rate. First one, which comes naturally, you would imagine, if you change the rate of slow depolarization from this rate to this rate, you would increase the heart rate, right? Because you would reach threshold faster. That makes sense, right? So what are the mechanisms by which we could increase the rate, the slope of the slow depolarization? Well, we can increase the activity of IH. Remember, IH helps the membrane depolarize, so if we give it more IH, we give it more depolarization, and that would increase the rate, right? That makes sense. If we increase the ability of K channels to close, that would allow them to close faster, so this is number 1. The 1 is happening here, 2 is happening here, and 3 is happening here, right? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Let me walk through it. If we increase the IH activity, we would steepen the slope of the ultra slow depolarization of pacemaker cells. If we increase the ability of K channels to close, we would speed the transition from repolarization to depolarization, which would also increase the rate of the ultra slow depolarization of pacemakers. And if we increase the ability of a few calcium channels to open, we would increase this part, which would also increase the rate of the ultra slow depolarization of pacemaker cells. Or we could decrease all of these things to slow the rate, right? So anything we can increase, we can decrease. The sympathetic nervous system does this, the parasympathetic nervous system does this. Okay, yes?
So the arrow is pointing in the right direction, rate increases.
This green arrow here?
The one above. Rate increases.
Okay, so the idea here is that anything that brings us to threshold faster increases the frequency, which is increasing the rate of it's increasing the heart rate. This is the heart rate, right? So anything that brings us to threshold faster decreases the interval, increases the frequency, which is increasing the rate, the heart rate. Does that make sense? It's a little bit of physics here. Anything that decreases the interval between a wave, I don't want to does this make sense? Even if it's been a long time since you took physics? Shortening the time increases the frequency, increases the rate of the heartbeat. Shortening the time between beats. Okay, so one general mechanism is to increase or decrease the rate of the slow depolarization. The other way, another way, is to make the maximum diastolic polarization not so negative, right? So if we start from a very negative position, we have a long way to go to threshold. And if we start from a not very negative position, we have a short way to go to threshold. And if we have a short way to go to threshold, we get to threshold faster, and that increases the heart rate. If we have a long way to get to threshold, that increases the interval between beats, and we decrease the heart rate. And so what would control the maximum diastolic polarization? Well, so this is sympathetic nervous system, and this is parasympathetic nervous system. And it all focuses on K channels, right? Because K channels, the voltage-gated potassium channels and the resting potassium channels are what control how negative the membrane potential gets after a beat. So if we decrease the number or activity of resting K channels or voltage-gated K channels, if we decrease their activity, it doesn't go as negative. Doesn't go as negative means we can get to threshold faster, so that's an increase in rate. That's why it's green here. My decrease here is green, because we're talking about K channels. If we increase the activity of resting K channels, we go more negative. We have a longer way to get to threshold, and we slow the heart rate. Now you can say, can't we do this? Can't we do both of these things at the same time? And the answer is yes. You can see that in the next slide. So we can. So I'm splitting these things out artificially to show you the three effects. So one is changing the rate of the depolarization. One is changing the starting point. What do you suppose the next one is? Oh, it's on the sheet. It's changing threshold. If we make threshold more negative, then we can get to it sooner. And if we make threshold more positive, we get to it later. What determines threshold? Remember, threshold is the transition from ultra slow to slow in a pacemaker cell. The channel that determines this ultra slow to slow is the voltage-gated calcium channel. So if we increase the activation of voltage-gated calcium channels, we lower threshold. We make it easier for a critical number of them to make this transition from ultra slow to slow. Does that make sense? All the channels, not all, but many of the channels that you've learned about in understanding these action potentials are important for understanding how the rate of the heart changes in response to sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activation. So let's put this together. Here is a cartoon of data of a pacemaker cell beating normally. And then what did they stimulate? They stimulated the sympathetic nervous system. And with a delay, you can see that the rate is increasing. Beat, 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 beat. You're going to do this in lab today. You're going to activate your sympathetic nervous system by doing some exercise. And you'll see your heart, somebody's heart rate increasing. You might also see it in the frog heart. Well, let's get into the mechanisms. The mechanism of the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the heart rate by this pathway. Beta adrenergic receptors is the name that are coupled to GS. Now we're going back to the beginning of the class, right? Remember GS. There's all kinds of stuff between GS and adenylyl cyclase, which you should know. It's part of the problem set, in class a couple of times. You can unpack this arrow with all kinds of molecular detail, which we don't have to go through because you know it. So GS activates adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase makes cyclic AMP, which activates PKA. So that's the pathway that you know about. Now, IH channels are activated by cyclic AMP. So cyclic AMP, the part of the pathway, activates IH What does IH do to the ultra-slow depolarization of a pacemaker cell? What does increasing the number of IH channels open do to the ultra-slow depolarization of a pacemaker cell? It speeds it up. So now we're talking about this. PKA phosphorylates calcium channels and stimulates them. And so we are talking about this and this. And so you could say, well, wait a second. So you should be able to see threshold getting lower. We can kind of see it. Here's threshold, 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 threshold. Down here, here's threshold. So it got a little bit bigger. I mean, this is a cartoon, so it's not showing it very clearly. But, here's threshold here. So it's hard to see because the slow depolarization has gotten so fast. So here was the rate of ultra-slow depolarization, but you can see it's getting faster. See it getting faster? So we're seeing the two things that we expect to see.
Can you repeat the PKA part?
PKA part? Protein kinase A, which is the final product of this pathway, phosphorylates calcium channels and makes it easier for them to open. Cyclic AMP binds to IH channels and makes it easier for them to open. And both of those work together to increase the heart rate. What do you suppose this does to contractile cells in the atria and ventricles? Let's think about the force. Does it make them contract stronger or weaker? Stronger. So now I've just revealed something that we'll come back to on Tuesday, which is the force of the heart is also controlled by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Right now we're focusing on the rate, but we're going to see the force in the frog heart, and we'll talk about it more next week. Okay, sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system slows the heart. And this is pretty dramatic. Beat, 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 right? A big delay. Yes?
I just have like a curiosity question. So you like you know how in the movies and stuff, like right before people die, their heart rate like picks up and then it like flatlines. Is that like a real thing, or is that just kind of a movie?
That could be a real thing.
But so why does it pick up?
So I think what's happening, I mean, I'm not sure, but I could make a plausible argument that what's happening when the heart is dying is that it starts to fail to pump blood. So it starts to fail. The decrease, we're going to talk about this next week, the decrease in pressure, because the heart is now failing. The decrease in pressure is sensed by the pacemaker cells, and the pacemaker cells say, we need more blood. So the one thing the pacemaker cells can control is the rate. They can't control the strength, but they can control the rate. So they do control the rate. They increase the rate, but the heart is failing, and so eventually the fact that it's increasing to a point doesn't have any effect, and Now we're talking about a heart stop. I don't think this is the only way people, I'm not sure this is the only thing you would see when someone transitions from living to dead watching their heart. It could just slow down and stop. It could also speed up and then stop. Let's talk about this some more next week when we talk about cardiac output. Anyway, getting back to the parasympathetic nervous system. The name of the receptors are the muscarinic receptors. These are muscarinic receptors to acetylcholine. So acetylcholine, let me go back to the neurotransmitter just for a moment. The neurotransmitter of the sympathetic nervous system is epinephrine. Adrenaline, which activates adrenergic receptors. The neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic nervous system is acetylcholine, which in the heart activates muscarinic receptors, which are GPCRs coupled to GI. Now you know, there's a story you know there. GI inhibits adenylyl cyclase and there's all kinds of things that you could do to unpack that bar. Inhibiting adenylyl cyclase decreases cyclic AMP because you got all those phosphodiesterases around there constitutively chewing up cyclic AMP. So that decrease in cyclic AMP is going to decrease the activity of pKa. Anything that decreases pKa is going to decrease IH and decrease calcium channels, just turning off what we turned on in the previous slide. And here's an interesting twist. The beta gamma subunits of GI stimulate a resting and voltage-gated passive check. The beta gamma subunits do this. So that's a weird twist. But the point is, now if we increase K channels, and so we're increasing this time between heartbeats. Increasing time between heartbeats is equivalent to slowing the heart rate. Okay, so, and those are the two key control mechanisms of the heart rate. Questions? Yeah. Is the force of the heartbeat decreased in the parasympathetic nervous system the way the force of the heartbeat is increased in the sympathetic nervous system? Similar, but not exactly the same. Yeah. When we think about sodium channels in the nodal cells, both SA and AV node, we are not thinking about the voltage-gated sodium channels. We are thinking about IH. And just the opposite. When we're thinking about sodium channels in contractile cells, in the atria and the ventricles, we're thinking about the fast voltage-gated sodium channels, and we're not thinking about IH. Epinephrine is the neurotransmitter for the sympathetic nervous system, and acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter for the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. More questions? Trevor.
So the rate doesn't equate to the force of the contractile?
The rate does relate to the force.
Okay. But
So
not exactly for the two systems. Two sympathetic.
Let's just say that it does.
Okay.
So a slow rate is associated with a weaker contraction, and a fast rate is definitely associated with a stronger contraction. Up to a point. You'll see next week, if we increase the rate too much, we can have a negative effect. But in this normal range. So if I activate your sympathetic nervous system, your force and your rate will go up. Maybe did you have a question?
Oh, my question was, the activity of the IEG channel was dictated by the amount of CMAP maximum, or
Yes.
is that dictated by the activity of the protein kinase A?
The IH channel is activated by hyperpolarization and cyclic AMP, and not so much PKA. So IH is opened by hyperpolarization, that's giving it its name, and by cyclic AMP binding to it. So so I'm introducing a new concept here. Cyclic AMP does two things. It binds to the regulatory subunits of PKA, and it binds to IH.
And how does that raise the?
How does this raise the rate?
Yeah. Do you talk about raising the ADP if that's a function too?
Do I break the what?
Yeah. No. You talked about raising the ADP to more positive in this situation.
This doesn't change the MDP.
Okay.
We don't see anything here that would affect the MDP. It changes this, and this change the rate of the ultra slow depolarization from a relatively steady MDP. And this changes the rate and the threshold. Period. This changes MDP, makes it more negative. Okay, so let's stop here for a break, and we're going to put this all together into the electrocardiogram. And then we're going to do that some more in the lab. And the electrocardiogram. And so remember, heartbeat starts in the SA node, and it reaches threshold and fires an action potential. Then that action potential, those action potentials spread throughout the atrium. That's the green action potentials. That's, now here's a key thing. The spread of atrial depolarization causes something that you can see on the electrocardiogram. Then it goes through the AV node, which you can't see. Then it goes through the AV node and bundles and Purkinje fibers. All of that flow is relatively silent in the electrocardiogram. But then the action potential spreads throughout the ventricles, and that gives you a big signal in the electrocardiogram. So we've got a small signal associated with atrial depolarization. We've got a big signal associated with ventricular depolarization. And then we're going to have a mid-sized signal that is associated with the spread of ventricular repolarization. Okay, so let's unpack this. Well, here's the way an electrocardiogram looks in the hospital, but you're not going to be recording electrocardiograms in the hospital, and you're going to be working with this in a problem set next week, so let's just hold off on that. I'll make sure that you're ready for the problem set when the time comes. That's not the goal right now. So, but the idea here is all these little wiggles are things that tell us quite a lot of information about the heart. And it's a non-invasive, it's non-invasive. How many of you have ever had an electrocardiogram taken on you or seen it been taken on somebody else? Raise your hand up high so I can see. Okay, so, half a dozen of you or so. Well, today you'll have an opportunity to have one taken on yourself or take one on your friend. So at the end of the class, at the end of the lab today, you'll all be able to raise your hands. You won't all have your ECG recorded, but you'll all be participating in an ECG recording, whether you're the patient or the doctor. So you'll see these squiggles, and you'll try to make sense of them. Let's try to make sense of them now. So here is a blow up of the squiggles of the electrocardiogram. And it's got, like everything else, it's got a name. Each of these squiggles has a name. So we're going to talk about the little bump that's associated with atrial depolarization as the P wave. It's got a name. Everybody in the whole wide world calls this little bump of the electrocardiogram the P wave. As far as I know, everybody in the whole wide world. I think in every culture where they take electrocardiograms, they call this the P wave. I'm actually not sure about that. Anyway, P wave associated with the spread of atrial depolarization. The QRS complex, the big guy, the big signal, is associated with the spread of ventricular depolarization, QRS, and then the T wave is associated with the spread of ventricular repolarization. And like everything else, it's got some, it's got a time scale and a amplitude scale that we don't need to focus on. The electrocardiogram is recording the electrical activity in the heart by placing electrodes on the skin. Right? We're gathering electrical information from electrodes on the skin, but we're recording electrical information from the heart because the heart is generating a fairly large electrical signal. All that spread of depolarization through the atria or the ventricles is a pretty big electrical signal. And the body's a pretty good conductor, and the skin is a pretty good conductor. So we can detect that electrical signal without breaking the skin by just recording on the skin. Now the signals are small. Notice the signals are small. Oops. A millivolt. So we're not talking about a big signal. We're talking about small signals, but they're big enough to see on the skin. The electrocardiogram, we don't just record from one electrode. We record from a set. And in lab, you're going to record from 3 different electrodes, 3 different sets. And in the hospital, they record from 12. So these electrode sets all have a name. So we talk about lead 1, and everybody in the whole world, as far as I know, uses the same language for the name of the electrodes. So lead 1 places one electrode on the left wrist, on the right wrist, and another electrode on the left wrist. And it defines a orientation in the heart or in the chest. That is in that orientation. So this lead 1 defines an orientation on the chest. So the head is up here, foot is down here. This is left, and this is right. We're looking at somebody else's body. Right. Left, right. Lead 1, you'll see, you're going to record lead 1 in lab. Lead 2 connects the right wrist and the left foot. And it defines an orientation in the chest like that. And lead 3 is the left wrist and the left foot, and it defines an orientation like that. So you will record all 3 of these today. But 3 isn't enough for an electrocardiographer, so they set up these augmented leads. And let's not get into the details. The augmented leads, the augmented ventricular right, augmented ventricular left, augmented ventricular right. define different orientations. ABR, ABL, and ABF. Why do we have this in, there's redundancy here. In an ambulance, if they need to record an electrocardiogram, they don't hook up 12 electrodes, they don't even hook up 6. They usually only hook up 1, lead 2. You'll see why lead 2. But in a hospital and in lab, we're gonna 6 gives you more information than 1 or 2 or 3. So there's redundancy in order to gather more information. So these are the so-called limb leads because they are connected. You can connect to the wrist or to the limb, arms and legs, and gather information about the heart and the chest. So these are called the limb leads. Limb. Foot. We're not going to be recording the augmented leads in lab. We don't have that machine. There are also the so-called precordial leads that we're not going to do at all, and we're not even going to talk about. But just the other, so this defines 6. I said there were 12. The other 6 are sort of wrapped around the chest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Notice, remember the heart is a 3-dimensional structure. These leads define a vertical plane, and these leads define a sort of slanted horizontal plane. And so these electrodes gather 3-dimensional information from the heart. 3-dimensional electrical information from the heart. There's redundancy, there's all kinds of redundancy, but the reason we have the limb leads and the precordial leads is to gather 3-dimensional information. Okay, so now let's make sense. Why do these leads tell us anything about the heart at all? Okay, so let's go back to the heartbeat. This nasty cartoon is supposed to illustrate. What is that supposed to illustrate? The yes and no. Why is it pink? It has just fired. Okay, it has just been activated. And it is spreading, the action potentials, the depolarization is spreading throughout the atrium. And that spread of depolarization can be illustrated as a vector. Now we're getting into physics again. What's the definition of a vector? It's something that has something and something else. Amplitude and direction. So the vector of atrial depolarization looks something like that, right? It's spreading throughout the atria. If we collect all of that spread into one vector, it looks something like that. If a vector is aligned with the thing that's detecting it, you get a positive signal. If the vector has a component that is aligned with it, but isn't perfectly aligned with it, you get a smaller signal. So this is the same vector, but we get a smaller signal here because this vector is not perfectly aligned with the lead that is detecting it. But you still get a signal because it's got a component. Remember, vectors can be broken down into components. This has a component that is parallel to the thing that's detecting. And if the vector, here's a vector the same size, if the vector is perpendicular to the lead that's detecting it, you get no signal. There is a vector, there is a detector, but the detector is blind to this signal because it's perpendicular to it.
So what is this like component, or what does that mean?
It's how we would analyze this. If we get a smaller signal in one lead than in another lead, we would say, okay, it's well aligned with this lead and it's poorly aligned with this lead.
But like looking at the heart, does that mean that like, because normally like
Yeah,
it
let
goes
me-
from the SA node down, right?
Yeah, let me, I think I will answer your question in the next 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. So let's just continue this alignment business. If the vector is anti-parallel to the lead, you get a negative signal. If the vector is partially anti-aligned with the lead, you get a smaller negative signal. And of course, if you have no signal, if you have no vector, you get no vector. If you have no vector, you get no signal. So how does this no signal relate to this no signal? Is that what your question? There's 2 ways to get no signal. One is to have the signal be so small as to be undetectable. And the other is to have a big signal that is perpendicular to the thing that's recording it. I think we'll see this a lot today. So let's build this some more. Actually, let's go back to this one. So here is the spread of atrial depolarization, the onset of atrial systole. Is this vector going to be detectable by lead 1? Yeah, because it's got a component that is parallel to it. Is it going to be detectable by lead 2? Yeah, it's almost parallel. I mean, it's quite well aligned with it. Is it going to be bigger in lead 1 than in lead 2, or bigger in lead 2? Bigger in lead 2, because it's more well aligned with lead 2 than it is with lead 1. What's it? Yeah. It's got a component in lead 1, but it's got a bigger component in lead 2 because it's more parallel to lead 2. It's not perfectly parallel to lead 2, but it's more parallel to lead 2, so you get the same signal, the same vector gives you a bigger signal in lead 2 than in lead 1. The same signal gives you a bigger, the same vector gives you a bigger signal in the electrode set that it's better aligned with. What's this are we gonna see anything in lead 3? No. Does that mean we have no atrial depolarization in lead 3? No, we have atrial depolarization, but lead 3 is blind to it. So you wouldn't want to use lead 3 if you were interested in atrial systole. You would use lead 2. Or lead 1. Or lead ABF. Okay? Now let's go to the early part of the spread of ventricular depolarization, or the onset of ventricular systole. Why would you get a negative signal? Oh, okay. So I think you're thinking about this exactly right. If the vector is like this, which is what it was, it's a little bit negative in lead 3. So, but I think so if it was like this, it's almost perpendicular to lead 3, and a perpendicular vector gives you no signal in that lead. So this is sort of the condition I was describing. Why lead 3 is blind to atrial depolarization. Did that answer your question? So now remember the action potential spread throughout the atria, and we got atrial systole. Slow depolarization, small little bit of tissue, can't see it on the skin. too small. Fast depolarization, but small, too small to see. But eventually, we start to get a spread of depolarization in muscle. It's in the septum. So this is the very beginning of ventricular systole. And it's spreading like this. It's called septal depolarization. So it sort of spreads, and it's also spreading this way. But the overall vector of this very early ventricular spread of depolarization is a vector that looks something like that. Okay? Is that going to be detectable in lead 1? Is it going to be detectable in lead 1? Yeah, why not? Yes, it will. Is it going to be positive or negative? Negative. It will be a negative signal in lead 1. Is it going to be detectable in lead ABR?
Yes.
Yeah. Will it be a positive or negative signal in lead ABR? Positive. Good, so you're getting the idea. So now, let's walk through the heartbeat. And rather than go through all 6 of these leads, I'm going to illustrate the vertical plane with 2 leads, because after all, 2 vectors define a plane, right? Lead 1 and lead ABF. I'm just going to use these 2, but you could also be thinking, okay, what would this look like in lead 2? Or what would this look like in lead ABR? And maybe we'll use that, but the slides only focus on 2. So here is the vector that represents atrial depolarization. Going back a few slides. It's positive in lead 1. It's positive in lead ABF. What is it in lead 2? Positive. Is it bigger in lead 2 than in lead 1? Yes. What is it in lead ABR? Negative. What is it in lead 3? Who knows? What is it in lead ABL? Who knows? We don't know yet. It depends on the defense. Everybody clear on why the P wave, which represents atrial depolarization, the spread of atrial depolarization, why the P wave is positive in lead 1 and positive in lead ABF, usually. Okay? So now let's go to that septal depolarization, right? When I say septal depolarization, what am I thinking of? I'm thinking of this situation. The septal depolarization, so in this cartoon, sorry, I'm jumping back and forth. So in the cartoon, I draw it like this. In this cartoon, which I didn't draw, it's drawn like this. But you get the idea, right? It's sort of spreading from left to right in the septum. The septal depolarization has a vector that is, and gives a signal that is negative in lead 1 and positive, or not very positive because it's almost perpendicular, but maybe a tiny little positive thingy in lead ABF. This is the beginning of the QRS complex. And if you become physicians, you will break down the QRS complex into Q and R and S. But we're not going to do that. I'm happy to do that in lab today if you want. But we're just going to call it the QRS complex. The QRS complex might have a negative going signal, or it might not, depending on the lead that you're measuring the signal and the direction of the signal. Yeah. One more? Yeah, and here is pointing kind of downward. This is trying to illustrate the fact that there is person-to-person variability. Not everybody's vectors are the same. And so there's going to be variability here. So don't get too hung up on, almost everybody has a spread of atrial vector that looks like this. But there could be quite a lot of variability. Some people, the vector will look like this. Some people, the vector will look like this. There's about 90 degrees of variability in everything that we're talking about. Okay, so don't memorize the numbers or the details of this angle. Just think about the general direction. Okay, so septal depolarization starts the QRS complex. And we see it as a negative signal in some leads, and we see it as a positive signal in other leads. And it's small because the septum is relatively small. What?
What is it called?
The septum, the interventricular septum between this is a very early start to ventricular depolarization. Now we're going to move into the apex. The apex of the heart, so we're going to spread into the apex, and the apex of the heart is the most massive part of the heart muscle. So we're going to generate a very, very big vector that is oriented something like this. Very, very big vector. Very, very big signal. Positive in lead 1. Positive in lead ABF. What's it going to be in lead 2? Big positive. What's it going to be in lead ABR? Big negative. It's big. And if it's well, what's it going to be? What's it going to be in lead 3? We don't know yet. Maybe nothing. It's positive in lead ABF. So the QRS, now we're seeing the big signal because we're looking at the spread of ventricular depolarization in the apex, apical depolarization, and the apex is massive. Now we're going to spread, so the next step, almost done, the next step is going to spread into the free wall. We're going to spread into the free wall. Because the left wall is more massive than the right wall, this spread is bigger than this spread, and we see a vector that looks like that. Right? Because this muscle is thick, this muscle is thin. And so we see a vector that's something like this, plus or minus 90 degrees, or plus or minus 45 degrees. And this would be a positive signal in lead 1 and a largish negative signal in lead ABF. So combined, let's walk through this more quickly. Septal, apical, big one, free wall, depolarization generates the QRS complex. And then later, so now, almost. So depolarization has spread throughout the ventricles. What do the ventricles do? Contract. But they're all depolarized. All the cells are depolarized and contracting. So even though they're all working very hard, electrically they're silent. Because there's no longer, they're all depolarized. There's no longer a spread of depolarization. So we're back to baseline. We're back down to 0. And then the spread of repolarization generates the T wave. Let's stop there. I can answer questions in lab today, and we're doing this. And I'll pick this up on Tuesday as well. There are some clickers, so I'll put them on Moodle. There'll be some clickers that you can use to test the knowledge.